whatever your identity, your sexual identity, your gender identity, neurodivergent, these were communities that historically had little to no access to public spaces of storytelling, could not share their stories. And that has radically shifted. Yeah.
My guest today is a recovering academic and an author and entrepreneur. We're going to talk about storytelling and girls and women's identities and who knows what else. Welcome to my little YouTube channel, Catherine Connors.
I am so excited to be here and to chat with you, Lisa.
I have been wanting to do an interview with you ever since I met you, and I heard about the combination and the intersection and the way your life has weaved its way through academia and being a professor, actually in my hometown at University of Toronto, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then working in the entertainment business, where, of course, the storytelling and identities are so much formed. And now I know you're thinking about social media too. So we're going to talk about all those things. But before we jump into that, I'm wondering if you could share something from your childhood, something from your family of origin, something from your early years that has maybe informed or guided or impacted who you are now and what you're doing in the world.
I almost can't even begin to talk about my relationship to story and storytelling without talking about my childhood and about the influence of my parents, my mother in particular, who was just, I using the past tense, she passed away last year. She was both my parents were gifted storytellers, but my mother had a view of the world that was profoundly animistic, right? And she loved folklore and fairy tale, and the world for her was just rich with opportunities for storytelling and for play. And she used to tell me when I was a kid that like she'd so looked forward to being a mother because she just knew it was going to be so much fun, right? Like it was an opportunity to play. So I grew up in the Vancouver area in British Columbia, which, you know, as I think you know, is like full of rainforests and moss and fungi and is very, 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 is a beautiful, beautiful outdoor environment. And from the earliest I can recall going on walks and hikes with my parents and my sister and my mom just regaling us with stories about the fairies that lived in the toadstools and the animal council that took place behind the trees. And it was every foray into the outdoors was this rich immersion in her own invented folklore. And so it cultivated me, just a deep, deep, deep passion for story, right? I was one of those kids, you know, that was like coming out of the library with stacks and stacks of books. I read every fairy tale I could get my hand on, but it was informed by that live oral experience that my mom, for her, it wasn't about teaching us so much as it was about, she just loved inventing stories about the world, about finding the magical and everything. So I grew up with this like just deep sense of the richness of story that's embedded in the world. And because it's just so like, because it started so young, it's just one of those very, very, very deep seated things for me that I entirely credit my parents and especially my mother for.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how that led you into maybe the earlier parts of your career? Because it does seem you call yourself a recovering academic, but your impact on the world in terms of feminist perspective and how people perceive themselves was rooted in your work in academia, I believe. Is that right?
I dropped out of post-secondary education like at least 3 times. I think I lost count. Right?
Twice.
High five on the dropouts, right? It was like, it took a while for it to take for me. I grew up wanting to be a writer more than anything. And, you know, when I graduated from high school, I had already started a program at Carleton University on like film and literature. And then I'd been like, you know, I was a nerdy student and was in this accelerated program, which I promptly dropped out of to move back to Vancouver and go to theater school. And I was, you know, I was trying to figure out what was right for me. I ended up going back to school for a hot minute before dropping out again because I decided I wanted to move to Europe to be a writer, right? So
I want to just pause there for a minute because I want to underline this piece. This is a very, very similar to my own path in terms of many different routes, many different chapters, even in the earlier years. And I also have a background as an actor. And so we have very many things in common. I've changed direction so many times. And I want to normalize that, because I think that that has been a challenging thing for certainly me personally to accept as a viable, reasonable path, because there's so much messaging in our world that we need to specialize and go deep and stick with things for a long, long time. And I think that that is not necessarily true for people like some of my viewers, some of the people who are watching my channel, but increasingly so as we're thinking about the generations that we're raising. Our kids, both of our girls starting college right now, post-secondary education can sometimes be a little ossified, not necessarily like open to what's possible. So all that to say that really want to normalize that it can be a really powerful path to follow what's right in the moment. And it sounds like you're a really good example of that.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that you underscored it, because there's a whole gendered element to that as well. Girls and young women in particular, like we really get socialized into a myth that if we are going to do something in the public sphere, we need to overperform, we need to hustle, we need to get the good grades, right? We need to do all the things in order to be on a path to in order to play the game in the right way, right? So it's a very, very gendered thing as well. So it's relevant for, I think, a lot of things that we're going to talk about. But I think it's also it's crucial, I think, in understanding. Like for me, the path has never been straight. Right. It's always been curvy. And I think that also correlates to the best stories, right? They defy, like, I'm a big believer in challenging and interrogating structure and story. We love our structures. We love our heroes' journeys. We love our 3 acts. We love all those things. But life doesn't look that way, right? We're so socialized. I've sometimes said that we believe in story, capital S, more than we believe in God, no matter what our faith is, because even our faith in a God or gods is based on stories. So we tend to believe very firmly that following narrative paths is a path to success or to righteousness or what have you, when in reality, it's like, oh, no, it's much more complicated than that. My mother's animistic world of fairies and animals in the forest, I always thought was much closer to what lived story feels like. It's sort of chaotic, right? It's mycelial, it's messy, there's so many paths and trails you can take. Whereas we tell ourselves, we tell our kids, we tell our daughters, you need to decide, you need to figure it out, you need to perform, you need to achieve. You need to get to X goal by X year. And like, it's a disservice. It's a disservice. There's this deep history of socialization where women and girls, especially in the West, are socialized to believe that like their place is in the private sphere. It's not in the workforce. It's not in politics. And obviously things have changed a lot especially in the last century. But from the point of view of the arc of human history, this is like really recent, right? That women are in the public sphere. I mean, we couldn't, in North America, I think like in Canada, women couldn't have credit cards until the late 70s.
70s, yeah. 1970s.
Yeah. I mean, it's like when you think about like 50 years ago, right? Only 50 years ago could we actually bank, right? Yeah. It's a blip in human history. So our movement into the public sphere has been really, really, really circumscribed by a lot of social expectation, a lot of stuff that we think about in the context of the good girl, right? And there's lots of good research, great books on this, of being cooperative, of being obedient. So girls are really socialized. Carol Gilligan and Lynn Michael Brown did really groundbreaking research on this some decades ago in a work called Meeting at the Crossroads. And there's tons of other work on this. Carol Gilligan was one of the biggest groundbreakers, but of really unpacking the dynamic whereby girls receive all these messages, primarily through story in some form or another, right? Mm-hmm. The movies we watch, the books we read, all the stories that float in the air around us, the sea that we swim in, that either they should stay in the home, they should become moms, right? They should be wives and mothers and, basically devote themselves to the private sphere. Or if they're going to move into the public sphere, they're going to have to do it on pretty specific terms. They're going to have to they're going to have to super achieve, right? And they're going to have to be cooperative. They're going to have to be good. They're going to have to be all these things. So for girls in particular, there's this socialization that we receive, and this has been, there are a lot of researchers that say like, okay, this is actually why we get the confidence gap, why we get the loss of voice, because girls hit puberty and they're like, they actually start to realize, oh shit, as a child, I thought maybe I could do anything, but now I'm in the world and men are looking at my body and I'm receiving all these messages that I'm expected to be a mother and my value is in my beauty and in my obedience. And that like really, really damages them. It's really confronting and even, we could say traumatic.
Yeah.
And so the girls have a choice. It's like you lock down, you shut down, or like hyperachieve, overachieve. And the girls look at the world. And I think this has certainly to some extent happened to me, even with, having hippie Catholic parents who were like, taught me to embrace chaos. It was still as a hyperachieving girl raised human being in the late 80s in Canada, I was like, well, I've got to go to university, right? I've got good grades. I've got to go to university. I've got to do X. I've got to do Y. I've got to do. So that's what I mean when I say it's gendered. We have all the stories in the world about how men break free from their constraints, right? Wow. It's the hero's journey. It's Luke Skywalker. It's all these stories about, the heroic man or boy gets to choose his path, and it's something that's beyond his home and his community, right? He gets to decide. His highest good is to achieve something in the public sphere that's extraordinary, right? For girls and women, it's find your way within the private sphere.
I'm curious to know how you would take the idea that you're talking about now and map it onto current, because it seems like a lot's changed in that way. And I 100%. Definitely recognize the storytelling that we were raised with in the 80s as being what you're describing. But I wonder if how much of that still remains or in what ways it might have changed.
So much has changed. Like our human culture has radically transformed more in the last 40 years than it has in probably ever. Right? Like Absolutely. This is the biggest and fastest series of turns in human culture, globally, that we've, as a recovering academic, I hesitate to say ever, right? But I want to say ever, right? Like there's, apart from maybe if you believe the myth of Atlantis, like sliding into the ocean, there haven't been as big and fast changes in human memory, right? On this scale. So 100% a ton has changed, and a ton has changed on the level of how we think about gender and sexuality and relationships. And it was the thing actually that pulled me out of academia was realizing, becoming very interested in what was happening in the digital sphere with women's storytelling. And my hypothesis at the time that I think has been borne out was like, well, this is actually going to change everything about how we talk about a whole bunch of things, because it was the first time in that you could really point to at scale that women were telling private stories publicly, right? So that
Can you give an example of that?
Historically, stories about motherhood, right, which was my point of entry. You would get, even most books about child rearing were written by men historically. Still, many of them are, right? It's like Harvey Karp is great, but he's a guy, right? Who's never born a child. And William Sears and, all the leading figures up until really recently were male authors. But even stories about even domestic fiction is still, a little bit niche, more often written by men than women until the last 150 years. Right. It's like Madame Bovary is written by a guy. Right. It's, there are far, far more male storytellers than there are female ones. So, and these I think are all sort of exceptions that prove the rule. So you'll get domestic, quote unquote, domestic fiction. I hate that it gets called domestic fiction, lady stories, right? Stories about women's lives, very few of which are we can rhyme them off on our hands, who are the notable female storytellers of the last 300 years. Right, since the emergence of the novel. And we probably stop at 5 or 6. It's all we can name, right? And then when you look at even contemporary, the 20th and 21st century of storytelling in terms of fiction and nonfiction. Like I said, most parenting books written by men, women's magazines, very niche, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal. Everything is about the home, and it's very, very niche. You get some outliers like Irma Bombeck and Helen Gurley Brown. So it's not like no women are telling any stories about women's lives, but it's niche, right? It's super, super niche.
Yeah.
With the advent of the internet and the consumer internet in particular, right, when it all of a sudden like Blogspot/Blogger made it really easy to set up a website, there's LiveJournal, there's MySpace, there are places online that you can really easily start telling a story. And women started telling stories about motherhood, public journals about what it's like to have a baby, right?
Right.
And this is the first time we really see an actually large-scale intervention into the public sphere of women telling private stories. So it's the first time we start having really, really meaningful public conversations about breastfeeding,
Yes.
about neurodivergence, right? Because we're starting to talk about our kids. So we're starting to talk about autism and ADHD and, health. We start talking about reproductive issues. It's easy for us to forget, like the internet history is really short. We were not talking about that publicly before, right?
Absolutely.
We were not talking about gender in the same way of like, how do we think about gender as we raise our children? It's really, really new, and it's still really fresh. Like we're a couple of decades into this barely. And it's caused a lot of change, but there's a lot of men's spaces that are very reactive to this sort of shift in how we talk about gender, right? They take it, not surprisingly, as a threat to traditional or conventional understandings of masculinity, right? So they take it like it's dangerous, it's bad.
It's against. Right? It's against.
So you see the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons and a lot of men that are just, and like this is, Donald Trump. It's like this is a lot of the right is animated by these fears that we're starting to throw things into chaos. Like it's masculinity and femininity are natural. Women should be in the home. You see the emergence of internet trends like trad wives, right? It's like there's influencers, young female influencers who are sort of flaunting the embrace of being a traditional wife, a stay-at-home, not just a stay-at-home, can your own preserves, but also like obedient to their husbands. Right. So there's still those threads that are persistent, and they definitely have an impact on our politics. There's a lot of pushback against this opening up around gender, but you're 100% right that we're shifting, the conversation's open, and the reason we're seeing pushback is because it's so radical. The other thing I'll say is that after I left Disney, and we haven't done a full narrative of my career, but I left Disney to build a media and research company to focus on what empowerment looks like for Gen Z girls and young women. And I really wanted to dig into what we do to empower them as creatives and visionaries and storytellers. So I did a bunch of research. And one of the things that we found in doing the research in the first 2 years was that girls were saying all the things about the stuff that's not fair, but they also talked about how it was really difficult for them to see the way that women's empowerment is presented culturally. That and they didn't say it in exactly this way, but what they would say was that they would react to models like Greta Thunberg or Malala or Serena Williams, who are extraordinary women. But the message the girls were telling us they were receiving was that if you're not extraordinary, you're not going to be out in the world. And so there was this pressure because of this empowerment messaging that you have to have made some great sacrifice like Malala, or you have to be hyper intelligent and committed like Greta, or you have to be a gifted athlete like Serena if you're going to make a mark in the world. They're getting this message that you can't be an ordinary girl and leave a mark in the world, right? You can't be an ordinary girl and live a rich, meaningful life. Look at this dozen extraordinary women in this book that you can look at. And that's, and there's obviously that's better to be given examples of things to aspire to, but it was having this effect of sending the message that if you're not extraordinary, and most girls, there's actually a really interesting Harvard study some years ago that said girls lose their capacity to see themselves as having genius around the age of 6. Right. Wow. So girls are already predisposed to think that they're not extraordinary or have the capacity to be extraordinary. And then they see all these messages in the world that to be an accomplished woman, you have to crush it, right? You have to be gifted. You have to be a superstar. You have to be heroic in a way that frankly, is like still really, really brand new for women and girls. So we found that there was alienating effects of that. There was one girl that said at one point that she was really worried that she was over the hill at like 19 years old, right? Because she was like Greta's 16, right? Malala's a teenager, right? Like we're highlighting all these, extraordinary girls. And then it's like, well, I'm 19 years old and I'm like barely passing my first year at college. So there's no hope for me.
Do you think that that's changed through social media? When I see things like TikTok and Instagram and the way that people show up and talk about their everyday real person, and there's connection in that, I'm wondering if that's part of the shift that is happening in terms of bringing it down to actual authenticity and reality.
It absolutely is. You're absolutely right about that. And there's a lot of things for us to worry about social media. Like social media has brought a lot of challenges that disproportionately affect girls and young women. But it has done an extraordinary amount of, I'll just call it good, in opening up conversations and opening up the horizon of possibility for identities. Because we do see, especially like TikTok is great for this, right? There's this curve towards what I will argue strenuously as a form of very authentic storytelling, even though we can say, oh, like they're trying to be viral, they're trying to game the algorithms, they're trying to get attention. Of course they are. Most storytellers in the public sphere have wanted to have their stories heard. But there's a lot of realism, right? Exactly, that is just much more accessible, right? And especially with the shift away from Instagram, right? You'd be hard pressed to find a young woman our daughter's age who loves Instagram as a platform the most. No, she's scrolling TikTok, she's probably on Snap. She's probably more private than we think she is, right? It was another thing we found in the work with girls post-Disney was that they value their privacy. They are very, very careful about what they put out. And yes, a lot of young people really enjoy creating in the public sphere, but they also really value sort of preserving their privacy and connecting with each other. It's largely why Snap still persists. But it is that TikTok has thrived in no small part, I think, because it's really showing real people. They're sharing their absurdities and their eccentricities and their weirdness, and the rise of the weird in digital storytelling, I think, is an extraordinarily valuable thing. For the first time in human history, we have democratized access to the tools and spaces of storytelling. The old joke was on the internet, no one cares if you're a dog. It's like you have access. And again, there's resource questions and literacy and fluency questions, but people of color, immigrants, girls, like whatever your identity, your sexual identity, your gender identity, like neurodivergent, whatever it is, it's like these were communities that historically had little to no access to public spaces of storytelling, could not share their stories, could only share their stories privately within private communities in the private sphere. And that has radically shifted how we think about a whole lot of stuff around identity. But again, it's also why we see a lot of resistance and we see a lot of counter movements and people insisting that the sky is falling and like culture is collapsing. And Elon Musk on Twitter just yesterday was like, it's apocalyptic. Like woke culture it's an apocalypse, right? It's like, there's nothing good is going to come from this opening up of people's identities and perspectives.
I also think that the degree to which we have access to information, for the most part, I think it's brilliant in terms of the widening of our perspectives and seeing into elements of the world that we just would not have had before. Yeah. And I often tell my kids, you cannot even conceive of the fact that when I was your age, I only knew the people who were at my high school, who were in my family, or maybe my friends introduced me to. Because we didn't know anything about people who lived across the world unless we went to the library and went through the microfiche to find a book to then read about it. But you had to get there before it closed at 5:00 if you wanted to do that research. We just didn't have access to information. And so in so many ways, I feel like our kids' generations have so much wider of a perspective. But they also have more stress because that's so much more choice and information constantly coming at them. So
yeah, it's a fire hose, right? I mean, you and I had the libraries and like Encyclopedia Britannica,
exactly,
right? and even in terms of identity, it's like if you're a gay kid in Canada in the 80s, like if like
you hit it.
you hit it, right? And odds are that you might, as a kid, just never ever meet a gay person, like, or a gay person,
or know you,
right? Or know who's a gay person, or a neurodiverse person,
Yeah.
or like any of that. And so you were completely shut off from the possibility of community and of like learning about so like identity was just so the horizons of possibility for identity were so, and community were so limited, and information was so we were limited to, and there's a lot of people that would like to go back to this, right? Like we need to like control, people want to ban books. You're absolutely right though, that we live in an age of information glut, right? We live in an age of story glut. Right? We live in an age where it's like we are all surfing on a very, very, very stormy sea with a lot of information. And that raises the bar on what's required to raise curious, informed children, and raises the bar on what we do in the public sphere as citizens and how we communicate with each other. So we're in this really interesting moment where we were freer than we've ever been. Right? In a lot of the most important respects. We are more knowledgeable than we have ever been collectively because of access to information. But we are also really messy, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of confusion and misinformation and tension and conflict that have everything to do with, I think in part because everything develops so fast that we just, we got really ahead of our skis.
I remember when I found out that you were both an academic in the world of feminism and identity, and also had gone to Disney to be a part of the impact on storytelling there.
When I left academia, it was because I'd started a blog to better understand women's blogging. The blog became very successful. It became an income stream in its own right. And it became something I was very passionate about. I'd taken a break to have my daughter from U of T. I was at the stage of starting to, and the reason I timed having my daughter then was like, this is what everybody told you to do as a female academic in the early aughts, was like, figure out your family planning because it might affect your candidacies for tenure track jobs. So I was finishing my dissertation. I was already teaching as a sessional. I was loving teaching. The work of my dissertation was looking at sort of the intersection of gender and story in like ancient and modern philosophy. It did not go up to the internet fully. Right. So when I fell down a rabbit hole of women's blogs, it was like, okay, this is kind of at odds with what I'm doing, but I want to pursue this. Right. Like I'm fascinated with this. So I set up a website, Her Bad Mother, and started blogging daily and found this community of women and was like transfixed as a scholar, but also just as a human woman who has always loved telling stories. Yeah. It became its own thing. And it ultimately became a thing that like just pulled me out of academia entirely because it became first an agency. And it was through that I worked with the United Nations. I worked with General Motors and Intel and Microsoft. And then at a conference, I met Rufus Griscom, who was the founder first of a site called nerve.com and was with his wife, Elisa Vokman, in the process of building and expanding a .com called Babbel. We met and started talking about women's storytelling and elevating the discourse of storytelling, not just about parenting in the family, but about all these spaces. And he convinced me to move my family to New York to help build that out. And I did. We created an ecosystem of storytellers that I'm very proud of. And Disney came calling and wanted to buy us. So I got bought by Disney.
Okay, that's how it happened. Got it.
Not on my bingo card. Right. If you had told me, gosh, even a few years before I, moved to New York, that whether I would, I was still as a mom, as a new mom, I was very critical of Disney. I had I'd written papers and done talks on the Princess Industrial Complex as somebody who was fascinated academically by folklore and myth and that sort of thing. Princess for me was this like, God, this is terrible. Right.
Yeah.
And as like a quote unquote woke mom, with a deep background in feminist theory, I was like, my daughter is not going to be a princess girly. Of course, anyone who has raised kids knows that you can't actually force those things. And so I was sort of in this dialogue with Disney as a mom first. Disney bought Babbel, bought me. And I found myself in this situation where I had been acquired I had a 2-year contract that was part of the acquisition terms. And I thought, well, I've got all these things to do. I was head of content for Disney Interactive, but I'm also going to push this princess question. And so I just was pushing internally. I found like-minded people. I found fellow believers and was like, we need to push this question. And it happened that this was at the time Brave had just come out and there were some controversies around Brave because although the movie did all the right things around a sort of quote unquote progressive or feminist princess story, some of the other moves by the company didn't support that. So there were a lot of discussions internally about The Princess and the Frog. Frozen was in development. So it was at a time when there were a lot of conversations happening and I just dove into the middle of it and started getting very aggressive with my thinking and my recommendations. And I had some credibility as somebody with an academic background and also somebody who knew the mom space really, 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 really well, that understood what at the time we weren't even calling them influencers or creators yet, but it was these are the discourse is changing. It's because of these amazing independent publishers and storytellers, and you need to pay attention. And so I was able to get some traction and shift some things. It was hard. The people that I worked with within the company who were fellow travelers and who were supportive were amazing. And I cherish that. I cherish everything I learned about storytelling in the industry. But ultimately I left because there were things that I wanted to do with everything that I'd learned. It was not something expected, but when the opportunity arose, I was very intentional about what I wanted to do with it and was able to really, I'm so grateful for the time that I spent at Disney. I have a lot of judgments.
That makes sense. But in terms of generalizing the experience that you have, what would you say was the essence of how you approached that situation?
My team, we were acquired into the interactive division, what was then, the interactive and games, right? It's now, there've been multiple reshufflings. So at the time it was interactive, it was a whole digital portfolio. It included some print publishing. We still had Family Fun magazine, games. It was a little bit of a hodgepodge of what we might call new media, right? Mm-hmm. And so Princess was coming up in a couple of contexts just within that, right? It's how are we treating content that integrates princess intellectual property, right, on our many websites? Rufus was phenomenal in really fighting for this, that the integrity of Babbel and our community of storytellers, that our storytellers need to be able to be critical of Princess even after we're acquired. Right. And the company gave us that, right, to their credit. It was part of the force of why Babbel was such a popular site and why we had such an amazing ecosystem of storytellers was because it was the best thinking and the best storytelling by the best independent creators at the time. And a lot of that had to do with them having the freedom to be critical of companies like Disney. So that was part of the conversation in the earliest stages of that relationship. And then it was, it's how do you make games about princesses? Should princesses be on social media? Huge, big conversation. So there were all these conversations that were starting to happen. And there was a lot of resistance in certain corners to how you evolve Princess to meet these new realities. But again, to the credit of certainly all of the people that I worked directly with, there was willingness to really explore what was going to be required to bring Princess and other girl-facing intellectual property into the 21st century and keep on pace with the culture. And the argument that I would make was Disney still is, the preeminent steward of fairy tale. The only reason really, we're still talking about Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and The Little Mermaid and all these ancient stories, which are not just Western, by the way, is because Disney kept them alive. Right. Prioritized them, as Snow White was an absolutely groundbreaking, a technologically groundbreaking film. So the Walt Disney Company made its name being the steward of fairy tale and folklore. And if you believe in the value of fairy tale and folklore for human society cross-culturally, then there's something really important about that. So the case I'd make is the Walt Disney Company needs to stay the steward of folklore, right? Mm-hmm. And it needs to be translated across in the various cases that we were talking about, whether it's like products or games or social media, what have you, it needs to be thoughtful about where is the next generation of kids and families going? Mm-hmm. What do they expect and want? And so to be an effective steward of folklore, the Walt Disney Company needed to be a leader in imagining where fairy tale and folklore could go. The fairy tale and folklore of the 21st century rather than of the 17th and 18th century.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, media is the last bastion or the current bastion of where storytelling gets a voice. One of my favorite movies is Tangled in that realm. I would love to hear any thoughts you have on that movie, if any, because I think that there's so many of the sort of archetypal things about relationships that felt to me like they were like brought to the surface, around the relationship between the mother and the daughter. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that particular one, just as a way of humoring my interest in it?
I mean, Tangled was before my time, not by very long, but it was sort of in the, as Disney was starting to like think about, sort of expanding.
Yeah, expanding
becoming
the narrative.
Expanding the narrative. Thank you. Notably, it's called Tangled, not Rapunzel, and it centered the male character. And that was an experiment on Disney's parts. And there were some people, this is like before my time, but they're sort of in the discourse. There's a not insignificant amount of criticism of this, that Disney kind of decentered the princess in order to center a male character. The story goes because it was to see if it would be more appealing to boys, right? Most research, by the way, shows that like children, boys, girls, like most of them don't care whether it's a princess movie or they're agnostic on these things.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that little caveat about I actually think that it was a really important experiment on Disney's part to center a male character in a fairy tale for the first time and to experiment with that kind of a little bit of a gender flip, right? And not least because Rapunzel saves Flynn Rider a couple of times, right?
Yeah. There was a bunch of flipping of the expected roles in that movie.
There's a bunch of flipping of expected roles. It was the first Disney princess movie to really kind of go deep into the mother story, right? And into the character of the villain. And even though she stayed a villain throughout the story, it paid attention to her motivations.
It was empathetic towards her.
It was empathetic. It really, really was. I mean, it didn't compromise on there was no she was a villain.
We saw into why, what
we got all her stuff around beauty and loneliness. And she is a beautifully complex character.
Yeah.
Right. And it was the first time in a Disney fairy tale where they're we're going to actually spend some time, right? And we can point to maybe Cruella de Vil, and there are bad female characters that Disney has paid attention to. But in Tangled, it really made that a core part of the plot and the story in a way that anticipates Frozen, really paid attention to the female experience of being trapped, which my thesis is this is, if we think of a alternative to a hero's journey, a princess's journey is not or a human's journey, a woman's journey, a girl's journey is not one of finding one's larger purpose in the world and saving the world. It is liberation. It's freeing oneself, whether it's freeing oneself from the tower or freeing oneself from the burden of expectations around motherhood, beauty, sexuality. Those are liberation stories, and they're very different from heroes' journeys. And Tangled is an excellent example of that, of actually exploring that, right, in a really, really rich way that kind of, slides under most critical interpretations of it.
To me, that's one that's so layered in terms of, is it critical of the identity of Barbie, or is it there's so many layers as far as I can perceive. So I'm curious to know your perspective on how that fits into the progression of storytelling of women's identity in our culture.
Yeah. God, the Barbie movie, we could have a whole hour.
I know.
And it's so funny. I was just ranting to a number of people over voice notes about I'd listened to a podcast that was sort of deconstructing the Barbie movie in a way that I didn't agree with. I was like, I didn't realize my feelings were so strong. I mean, I knew I had a lot of opinions about it. Like on the whole, very, very positive, right? So here's the thing that I've been thinking about recently is that a core piece of criticism around the Barbie movie was that end of the day, it was really just a long ad for a toy. Right. And so there's this sort of meta commentary, right? That the bad guys in the movie are the Mattel executives who are the ones ultimately that are making the money off of the Barbie movie. Right. So
I mean, I just think it's kind of brilliant. Yes, that's
it true. Is. It absolutely is. But
the
it's
meta aspect of it.
The meta aspect of it. But I really think that that's it's a key piece of what works about the Barbie movie, right? And this is a key piece of what, of like what the thinking needed to be around Princess is that you cannot shy away from the fact that this is a commercial capitalistic enterprise, right? These are products. These are toys. This is entertainment. But then you drill it down, right? And toys are so important to our story making experience, for girls in particular. Barbie is this point of entry into an imaginative world for many that isn't about motherhood, right? That isn't about the family, that is about just kind of chaotic, imaginative, story generative play. Right? Like Weird Barbie is a beautiful, beautiful example of the brilliance of integrating the fact that it was Barbies were never just fashion dolls, right? I defy you to find I'm certain I'm sure there are some people who know these, but I've never spoken to a woman who only played with Barbie as a fashion doll. But she's a doll. It's play. And so the movie fuck it, it's play, right? And it's commercial and it's a brand. And that's fine because part of the story we're telling is how a toy, a brand, a commercial enterprise shapes gender consciousness and shapes how we understand story. It's interesting because one of the things I used to say a lot at Disney was I used Barbie as a cautionary tale, right? Because at the time, so between 2011, 2015, Barbie was at a really low point. Barbie was not doing well, right? Barbie had really sunk. So I used Barbie as a cautionary tale. And I talked about here's the existential threat to Princess. Princess, capital P, could become like Barbie. At that time, and my daughter was young, it was I knew women who wouldn't bring a Barbie as a gift to a birthday party. It was just sexualized, male gaze. Barbie was persona non grata in a lot of circles. And Barbie's sales were plummeting. There was a real effect on Mattel's bottom line because Barbie's brand was so tarnished. And honestly, it didn't look like it would recover, right? I was certainly making the case, right? It's Barbie's donezo. Right? And it's a shame because I loved Barbies as a girl, but Barbie is so associated now, it's almost a bad word. It's so associated with a certain kind of female oppression that this multi-billion-dollar brand has sunk. And so I would say it's Princess, frankly, faces this kind of existential risk. The more Princess is associated with just love and happy endings and skinny bodies and beautiful ball gowns, this is going to happen. It had already started happening. Peggy Orenstein had already written Cinderella Ate My Daughter. Goldie Blox had done a viral ad that aired on the Super Bowl of girls burning down their princess castles. It was already starting to happen. So to flash forward to last year to Greta Gerwig's brilliant, I know she co-wrote the script with her husband, Noah Baumbach, exploration that took head on the fact that this is part of a global consumer enterprise, but that matters for how we think about gender, how we think about feminism, how we think about the consciousness around female empowerment, how we think about masculinity and femininity. It had to take that on. It could only do it by making it super fun and super entertaining and unabashedly open about its capitalist imperatives, right? Because that's the conversation.
With a bunch of layers of irony in there too.
With a bunch of layers of irony. It was it's in some respects, the old me that spent way too much time in postmodern and post-structuralist gender theory. Let's say it's this is the ultimate postmodern feminist take on anything. This is all that is solid melts into air, and you get Barbie and Ken, and it's like it's amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's all sorts of quibbles that I sort of had with certain things. I think actually the Barbie movie is more about motherhood and adult womanhood than it is about girlhood. And I'm not the only person to say that. There's so much stuff that is so deep and rich about it. But the deepest and richest stuff is about this. What is the intersection of entertainment and toys and commerce and how that shapes how we think about things? And it points to, I think, the most hopeful paths forward. We need our feminist discourses to be fun. We need it to be entertaining, right? As the anarchist Emma Goldman once said, I don't want to be part of any revolution in which I can't dance. It's like, I want to be part of a revolution where there's lots of parties and toys and like pink, right? And glitter. And it was this validation of that.
What would you say is the current for you right now? And I hope you'll come back on again and we can talk about some more things, because there are so many other things I want to ask you, but I feel like we just are barely scratching the surface. But what would you say is current for you right now? What are you thinking about? What do we need to, what's the story, the current?
So I continue to think constantly and always about gender and storytelling. And I've got a research project that's just a passion project. So when I say recovering academic, recovering social scientist, I'm building another research project in that sphere that maybe next time I'm on, I'll tell you about. I'm thinking a lot about the future of storytelling, and especially how in this moment of really rapidly accelerating technologies, not least of which is AI, but also metaverse, Web3, like a lot of the shifts in social platforms and in media more broadly, how that is impacting, could impact, might impact all of these extraordinarily good and extraordinarily problematic elements of the storytelling landscape. So what is the future of genre, right? What is the future of children's storytelling? How can female storytellers and female identifying storytellers really like seize opportunities around AI to kind of redefine new creative spaces? One of the things Taylor Lorenz wrote I've got it right behind me, Extremely Online, amazing book called Extremely Online, in which she really paid really important attention to the legacy of women in the emergence of what we call the creator economy, the digital economy. Like, it was women that shaped it, right? Women who like innovated in online storytelling, really carved the way for personal storytelling. And I think that women, female identifying creators and storytellers have that opportunity to sort of create new discipline and new creative paths with the technologies that are emerging now. So I'm thinking a lot about that. And I'm also recommitting to my personal storytelling, which I haven't really done since I stopped posting regularly to the blog that I was writing when I left academia. So I'm actually going back to my roots a little bit. Instead of on the blog, I'm going to do a Substack that's just going to be personal writing that is mostly just for me, and is very intentionally going to be an exercise and not trying to build a brand, but just to like really go back to what I used to do and experimenting with what does it feel like to write in the public sphere, just for the power of writing in the public sphere and connecting with other people and that sort of thing. So I'm oddly jazzed about that. And very few of these things are things that make me any money. It's a lot of passion projects. So we'll see what I do next professionally.
What I love about that is you're talking about going deeply into your own process. That's more your own internal process, but you're also thinking about on the other side of things, what does it mean for us to be in the public eye and how we're showing how our storytelling is in the public eye. So I want to put a pin in, maybe you'll come back and talk about this aspect of technology and where it's going and how AI impacts women's storytelling and how we're impacting it also. Please share with my audience where they can learn more about you, where they can read your work, where they can follow you online.
The fastest route to find me is via social, primarily Instagram. I'm at HerBadMother on Instagram and on Threads. And, my website is still up and active, herbadmother.com, which is where any updates on things like research and Substacks will travel through there as well.
And I'll put all those links in the show notes. And I want to say thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your wisdom. I'm looking forward to having the next conversation. And if you're watching this and this has been useful for you, please subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, you can see some other videos here and here.